Well, you may have heard that stark projection that Africa may be the next epicenter of COVID-19 in the world. Well, we don't want that, might I say. That will not happen. But that will be dependent on the kind of work we do as individual nations and as a continent at large. And you know that South Africa is an epicenter, in quote, in Africa. So this is a time to compare notes, learn from what others are doing, what we should not do as a country, what we can, do together as a continent. Dr. Mayowa Kolade joins us this morning via Skype from South Africa to give us an insight about that fight against COVID-19 in South Africa. So I understand South Africa has over 3,600 confirmed cases this morning. Good morning, Dr. Kolade, and thank you for joining us on the program.
Good morning, Kayode Okikelu, and good morning, everyone.
It's great to have you. Now, I know it's been quite a journey for South Africa. If you can just walk us through that journey, and where is South Africa at this point in the fight against COVID-19? Are you at the point where the curve is, dipping, or is it flattening? Tell us, how has it been so far?
Thank you very much. Great question. About the 5th of March, that was when the first COVID-19 case was detected here in South Africa. And that was in a particular region called KwaZulu-Natal. And since then, it's climbed rather steeply, or it did climb rather steeply, up until about 60 cases where the government put restrictions to large gatherings, closed schools. And from there onward, it was quite steep, and cases were increasing daily by about 200 till about 500 thereabouts, and the government announced that there was going to be a lockdown in 4 days' time. That lockdown has been on so far for over a month now. Since the lockdown started, the curve began to become less acute. So the numbers started to be about 35 cases per day, 40 cases per day. However, in the last 1 week thereabouts, it's taken another steep turn. We've started to have about 200 cases, about 164 yesterday, 170, something thereabouts, over the past 4 to 5 days thereabouts. Now we're at 3,600 plus cases. To put that in context, however, is to also see that there are over 1,000 recoveries here in South Africa, so it's not all bad news. Over 1,000 recoveries. The deaths are about 65, and based on the numbers of cases to the deaths, the case fatality ratio is about 1.5 thereabout. Now, comparing it with what's back home, our population is about 200 million. South Africa is about 50 million. South Africa has done about 130,000 tests. We have done about 8,000. And with the number we've done, about 8,000, 9,000, there are close to 30 deaths, a little under 30, 28, if I'm accurate by the last numbers. That puts us at a case fatality rate of 3.5%. That sort of compares and contrasts not just absolute numbers, but the feel, permit my use of words, in looking at how it is here in South Africa and how it is in Nigeria.
If you were to compare our strategies, well, you have raised very, very dire issues there, but if you were to compare strategies between what South Africa has employed in this fight and Nigeria, what are their comparisons, what are the differences, and what are the similarities?
Comparing strategies would be very nuanced. And I see this because here's an analogy. When we're back in high school or elementary school, primary school, secondary school, and your teacher were to tell you to tear out a sheet of paper for an impromptu test, that's kind of how COVID-19 is. Now, all we are doing between tearing out that sheet of paper and the actual test starting is kind of the phase we are in right now. In that moment is residual knowledge that comes to play. Your health system can't just magically change overnight. The number of ventilators you had can increase because you can buy more. That's if you find to buy. But ventilators don't operate themselves. There's a very specialized team around that. So I'm just using that to as a backdrop for what I'm about to say now as regards strategy. So the strategy here is, first of all, I should say it's very clear. We are not in the dark as regards the stage we are. We're not in the dark about what the numbers are expected to be from a public health standpoint. We're not in the dark as regards our current capacity and our rearrangement to ramp up that capacity for when we expect the peak of the curve to be, speaking from a public health standpoint. At this juncture, I should really commend the work that the NCDC is doing. Based on our previous capacity, they're doing an amazing job. And that's what happens when you have round pegs in round holes. People like Dr. Chike Ikweazu, people like Professor Aki Abayomi, and even the work that federal government parastatals are doing, institutions, tertiary institutions like the University College Hospital, you know, how things were swung into action very quickly when the first set of cases were discovered. The main strategy here is prevention. And that's a similarity with what we have back home. A few days ago, the chief medical director, whilst on an interview on your program, said that our best attack is defense right now. We can't wait for the cases to come before we start to respond because it will overwhelm the system. However, the differences in our strategies perhaps lie in the fact that here there's a very clear communication of that strategy. My senior colleague and the president of our association, the Nigerian Medical Association, because I'm a member of the Nigerian Medical Association, has communicated the fact that there seems to be some disconnect. You know, not putting blames at where the source of disconnect is from, but there seems to be some disconnect. People who are the foot soldiers at the forefront of the battle wish they had more communication from the, or wish the strategies were clearer communicated to them. So here, for example, we know very clearly that according to what the public health experts are saying, we are not yet even at the peak. The peak is expected to be sometime around August. Now that can seem unsettling. We're about 3,600 cases, and they expect the peak to be in about August. But then I should also say that where we are right now is very far from where we should have been. The projections were about we'll be around 10,000 cases by now and far more deaths. So the strategy is such that there's a lot of iteration and reiteration. Right now, we have to be very nimble on our feet, and we have to be very, very swift to move, very swift to react, to change strategy. But essentially, first is that communication is very clear.
Right.
Second, there's mass testing. Yeah. Yes, please.
Let me just take you up on that testing, because the conversation we had with Dr. Fadile also had to do largely with the kind of approach we are taking when it comes to testing. What's the approach to testing there? I understand that, over 130,000 tests have been conducted. How did you achieve that so fast?
It's a balance of two things. Number one, from the outset, priority was placed on testing. Secondly, the other side of the balance is their pre-existing capacity. This is the part that sort of pains my heart a bit, because we seem to have, or we ought to have had a little edge, being that we had the Ebola virus scare some time back, and we probably should have been in a better place with our pre-existing capacity to test with molecular tests, which is what's happening here. Molecular testing is essentially what's going on here, not the rapid as yeah.
So, sometimes it's quite tricky when you say we. I'm not sure whether to think we as Nigeria or we as doctors in South Africa. But then there's a lockdown in South Africa. It has been on for a while.
We is Nigeria, and we is always Nigeria. I'm Nigerian to the core, a Nigerian, a patriotic one at that. So we is always Nigeria. Permits, my apologies for times when it may have been a little unclear. But we is Nigeria.
It's great to know. Yeah. So I'd like to talk about the lockdown. Thank you for clearing the air. Now, we are on a lockdown here in Nigeria too, but in South Africa, I understand it's been on for maybe longer than it's been here in Nigeria. We're entering our fourth week here in Nigeria. How has it been in terms of awareness, in terms of people adhering to that? I know it was almost lifted at some point. Now soldiers are going to be drafted into this. So how is it there?
Well, answering that question would be looking at it this way. The initial plan was for 21 days, 3 weeks. And there, about the end of the second week, the president announced an extension of an additional 2 weeks. It's been challenging in the sense that there is a sizable informal sector here as well, just like we have back home. So these are people that you won't expect them to shun their daily bread because of something that they can't see. That's a challenge back home as well. And that may not be too far from the reason why the government is recruiting the military now to sort of enforce the lockdown. However, I should say that the palliatives have been pretty impressive, to be honest. The palliatives have been pretty impressive. And I think this is perhaps because the government has a strong pre-existing database. They know who the vulnerable are, and these people are going to go to certain places to collect grants. And the South African president addressed the nation on Thursday and mentioned that more grants were being rolled out. And one thing I also see here that sort of makes it slightly easier than I presume it will be back home is that there's a lot of trust in the public system. Nobody's expecting that the grants have been released. People are going to use that to, as we will say colloquially in Nigeria, to chop money. There's quite a lot of trust, or I should say, relatively higher trust in the public system than seems to be the case back home. Yes.
Well, another challenge that a number of people have raised, perhaps also in South Africa, is that while, yes, there is a high level of compliance to the lockdown, but then occasionally you go out, people are not abiding by the lockdown and taking all those social measures, which is why we understand that the government is trying to send out the military. And then you said that communication has been quite effective. So there seems to be a kind of a mixed bag there. How are the people taking on board the lockdown? Because it will seem like, as is here, many people are finding it difficult staying at home.
Apologies if I didn't make that clear earlier. So the lockdown is most challenging with people who are in the informal sector. So people who are taxi drivers, people who are petty traders, people who, and you see, these are also the people who are at the lower economic rung of the ladder. These are people who, not trying to profile people, but these are people who have a higher likelihood of perhaps having HIV, which is a serious problem here. HIV with TB, multi-drug resistant TB. These are people who also are overcrowded, who live about 10 people in a shack. And these are the people that the government is actually afraid of there being community spread amongst them. So those are the people that, from time to time would be a little unruly, be a little... So those are the people that sometimes would project as though the lockdown is not being effective. It is effective, I should say here, in all honesty, but it's because of the different socio-economic differences that those things bring about the different responses in different social classes. For example, somebody who earns a good living can buy foodstuff, stock up, and stay at home. He has money to pay for internet subscription. He has money to pay for cable TV. He stays in his house. But you see, these are the people who were initially infected because they're the ones that had the propensity or the means to travel internationally and get infected. But now the pattern is starting to change. Remember I said earlier that the curve was a little steep. That initial gradient was as a result of those who traveled into the country. So imported cases. It flattened a bit when the lockdown was started, but it's taking a peak again. And now this second peak is from the spread in the community. That's the concerning part. Okay. And this spread in community, yes. So that's...
Well, we're really grateful for the time you took to explain some of these things and give us this perspectives of what is happening in South Africa. Dr. Mayowa Kolade, thank you so
Thank you for the
much
privilege.
for your time this morning as a medical
Thank you,
practitioner
man.
in South Africa. We'll be back in a moment. Please stay with us.